Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I am Yuyun Zhan, and today we will unpack the two sessions, the Chinese government's annual plenary sessions of the National People's Congress and of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, held between 5th and 11th of March this year. This episode is in part of Zhonghua Mundus, our series about global China as seen from Europe. It comes out each month along with our China newsletter under the same name. The link to subscribe is in the show notes. I am with our senior fellow Alicia Garcia Herrero joining from Taipei. Hi Alicia, how are you?
All fine, and you? Looking forward to our podcast.
Thank you, as always. And joining us today from Beijing is Mr. Zichen Wang, a research fellow and director for international communications at the Center for China and Globalization, a think tank based in Beijing. He is also the founder and editor of the newsletter Pekinology. Zichen, welcome to The Sound of Economics.
Well, thanks for the invitation. It's a great privilege to be here and good to hear your voice again, Alicia.
Thank you so much for joining, Zichen. In Premier Li Qiang's work report at the two sessions, he aims to transform the economic model and keep growth rates at around 5%, which is slightly less than China's actual performance back in 2023. The stock market has also reacted quite badly to the target. Alicia, what kind of signal this is sending? Does this show a lack of confidence coming from investors?
Well, I think there's lots of confidence as far as the target is concerned. That's clear. This is a target that, in a way, does not take into account both structural deceleration, but most importantly, a very strong base effect last year, which helped the Chinese economy grow 5.2%. So in a way, it's harder than ever. Maybe not than ever, but certainly harder than last year, but the target is the same. When we look at the measures that have been announced to reach this target, I would say they're much less obvious than the target itself. So this is why I've summarized the situation as a target without a path, or a target without means, or a target without instruments. But as everything, I may not be reading enough between the lines. Maybe Zichen can help us read between the lines, and he can throw some light to these policy instruments that will help China reach this 5% target. I mean, I understand that there's probably these new productive forces that Zichen will focus on. I'll comment on that later, but I was mostly referring to demand policies, to fiscal policy, to monetary policy being very underwhelming compared to what the market was expecting.
Yeah, Zichen, could you give us an overview of key policy announcements?
Yeah, sure. On the 5% growth target, I think both the Chinese and the Western perceptions are that it is indeed very ambitious, as Alicia just put it. For example, I think Zheng Shanjie, the minister in charge of the National Development and Reform Commission in DRC, told a press conference that it can be reached with a jump. Although, the Chinese government believes the target is scientifically supported and, coherent with China's 14th five-year plan and matches the economy's potential, but it is still need to be achieved through hard work. And I think for economic growth target set out in China's government work report every year, it is also playing a role of guiding basically the Chinese government as well as the Chinese societies their work in the year. Because from the perspective of necessity, without specifying a certain economic growth rate, there will be a negative cycle of a sluggish real economy, lackluster capital markets, and anxious social sentiment, making it difficult for the economy, the finance, and society to stabilize and boost up confidence. And making it a little bit more ambitious actually sends a signal for steady growth, which in theory would help to enhance market expectations and confidence. And as Alicia said, there is a base effect because 2024 is the second year after the pandemic. And the sky effect from COVID is gradually fading. And I think within the work reports, there are policies on expanding total demand, relaxing supply constraints. There are what the Chinese government believes will boost market entities' confidence and stabilize the real estate sector. In the Chinese mainland, rational, the 5% is ambitious, but also achieving it is highly probable. I understand Alicia's concern. I think, outside the Chinese government, many believe the announced policy support so far is still very modest. For example, the new action plan to boost equipment upgrade and the so-called old for new trade-in for consumer goods announced even after the NPC meeting didn't include any new fiscal stimulus. We are seeing, for example, relaxation of purchasing restrictions in property. The latest example being Hangzhou in eastern Zhejiang province. But many believe the removal of similar restrictions have to come much sooner. Also, there may need to have a stronger credit support for ailing real estate developers. At the two sessions, Yi Gang, the former central bank governor of China, actually proposed to establish a sort of insurance mechanism for the pre-sale funds held by the real estate developers so that they can use the money to speed up delivery of housing projects under construction. And the relaxations on the demand side, the purchase restrictions should also be sped up. And in the questions you also mentioned about the stock market, I think China's stock market really took a dive before the two sessions in the months, and China even replaced its securities regulator, so the CSRC now has a new chairman. And but if you put it in a longer period of time, by 12th, which is one day after the two sessions, the Chinese stock market has seen some of the benchmarks surging 20% from its lows, a sign that the battered market may be headed for a more sustainable uptrend after multiple false storms over the past year. The Hang Seng Tech Index, the CSI 300 of mainland Chinese stocks, they are all up from a 5-year low reached in, I think, about early February. In more recent days, which is of course after the two sessions, we are seeing headlines like China's stock valuations are way too low on CNBC, and funds that have dodged China's stock route says it's time to buy on Bloomberg, and of course that also speaks to the blood that has been shed during previous falls of the stock market. Yeah.
Thank you so much for unpacking the policies that were announced at the two sessions for us, Zichen. Alicia, do you want to come back to that?
No, I think this was very useful. Thank you, Jim, because, it does give us a better sense of the government intentions. From the rest of the world, what we really look at is this expected additional increase in manufacturing production in China. We just got data for January, February, industrial production booming over 7%, consumption barely 5.5%. So for us, this means more overcapacity. We may be misreading. I want to hear your views, but this was really essential, in my view, in the two sessions, the idea of these new production forces. Some have compared this to Made in China 2025, so a new wave of upgrading of industrial production in China. This, again, comes back to who's going to buy all of this. And we Europeans are fearing that we might be the ones buying all of this because the US is closing down in terms of, more protectionist measures. So what do you take from this NPC's meeting in terms of China's objective as far as the industrial policy is concerned? Is it going to be even more of this and what it means for the rest of the world? Yeah.
I think you are right, and the numbers yesterday, especially on the industrial numbers and exports were, from the Chinese point of view, I guess it's quite optimistic because, last year the basically trade numbers were very bad. There is expectations for the trade numbers to improve this year. And I understand there is concerns not just in the European Union, but also in the United States as well, as China's exports of EVs, of lithium batteries, of solar panels flooding the market and basically dealing a fatal blow to the local industrial base. And domestically, these exports are, celebrated as what is called in Chinese, 新三样, the new three type of things. And in big numbers, they are actually quite slow. For example, last year, all the three things, the export amount to actually 1 trillion yuan, which is just less than 5% of China's entire GDP. And like a leading domestic investment bank says, like the entire value chain of EVs in China make up only 1.6% of China's GDP. Well, compared to the real estate industry, which is estimated to account between 15 and 30% of the entire GDP. So yes, they capture the headlines and they dominate the news. But they are maybe the future of the industrial upgrades, but they themselves, so far at least, they cannot form the pillar of sustain the China's economic development, like the most important part of that. And if you look at the numbers, I think, for example, in the 5.2% growth last year, the biggest contribution still comes from consumption. So the Chinese economy as the second largest one in the world now is mainly dependent on domestic demand. And I think, there are many commentators who also believe basically the domestic market, because of the 3 years of COVID and traditionally China's the household's share of the economy is low. So there needs to be a lot of work needs to be done on growing the domestic demand rather than just relying on the exports, especially to the European Union, to Britain, to the United States, where bilateral ties are actually not at their best. And so trade frictions may well arise, and the EU has already launched some investigations into Chinese exports.
So you're saying China is trying to expand domestic consumptions, continuing last year's efforts. That's also what Premier Li has pledged in the work report. Alicia, how do you feel like this transformed in the economic model?
Well, based on experience and recent economic history from 2008 onwards, it's really very hard for China to change its economic model towards a consumption-based model because none of the attempts have really worked. If you look at, China's share in global consumption is about 18%, manufacturing is 30%. So, we're very far. So I would imagine that the measures need to go beyond in terms of fostering both state-level insurance, which for us Europeans means a welfare state. And you can also do it privately if that's not of the liking of the Chinese government. This could be, bolstering private pensions, you name it, all kinds of private insurance mechanisms so that people do not need to save beyond what is necessary. Yeah. So I don't really see a major reform, whether it's welfare or privately driven insurance, to achieve further increase or a much, much bigger increase in consumption that would be needed. So this is why I worry that the measures are not enough. In other words, we need structural measures to achieve this.
Well, actually, I totally agree because, China, as large as its economic size is still a developing country where the GDP per capita is just $13,000, which is like 80 something around the world. So the very big difference between the Chinese economy and the development economies is that the impact of macro economic policies, where in the developing countries they are more mature, generally experience lower growth rates, But for developed economies, macroeconomic policies largely determine the overall economic trend and outlook. However, China is not at that stage. It has still, I think, by most accounts, around 5% growth potential. It's not in a low growth phase. So in its medium growth phase, China's macroeconomic policies primarily play a stabilizing and balancing role. So, economists like Liu Shijing, the former deputy minister for the State Council's Development Research Center, is that structural reforms actually has something like 80% contribution to the overall economic growth. So that actually illustrates the importance of structural reforms. Therefore, to maintain stable growth, it's essential to properly manage macroeconomic policy. And however, China must not solely focus on that. It should, there is a lot of restrictions on household registration system, on the land ownership system, on the pricing levels. And these are all the things that, China should strive to reform in its future path.
Of all the reforms that you mentioned, are there anything that's undergoing? Is there anything that we should look out for?
Well, actually, I really want to flag a development that's actually 3 weeks before the two sessions. So it's around, I think, February 19th. Xi Jinping was chairing the fourth meeting of the Commission for Comprehensively Deepening Reform. And he said, basically, 2024 is another important year for comprehensively deepening reform. The primary task for this year is to make plans for further comprehensive remarks, which is, in his words, the sequel of practice since the third plenary session of the 18th Communist Party of China Central Committee, the third plenary session in 2013, 10 years ago. So everyone who watches China's economy closely, understands, over 10 years ago, there was a 60-point package. So, my takeaway from Xi's remarks as reported by state media is that China is now making plans for further comprehensive reforms, and Xi himself proactively pairs these upcoming reforms at the same scale as the 60-point reform package 10 years ago. So that should give reform-minded people some hopes that the party and the government is actually working on, propose and study a package of future reforms. For example, the place I'm working at, the Center for China and Globalization, the founder and president, Henry Huiyao Wang, has been actively floating the reform agenda of the rural land system. And recently in the Chinese press, we are witnessing more discussions about structural reforms. But of course, at the end of the day, what will actually materialize, we will have to see.
Alicia, from your perspective, during the past 10 years, what kind of reforms China has been going? And do you think, compared to 10 years ago, are they on the right path?
I think China needs to be commended for the huge amount of reforms it did prior to WTO accession, 2001, and surrounding the accession. But I would argue that the last 10 years have been much less reformist, if I may say, than before. And I don't want to say that this was as easy as in the past. In other words, the low-hanging fruits for reform, opening up, trade opening to FDI, all of these juicy reforms with a lot of growth potential have already been done. So the reforms that China needs to do now are harder. And that might explain simply why we were not seeing them. By the way, we're not seeing them elsewhere, in Europe as well. So, don't take this personally, because in Europe, we know a lot about reforms we know we need to do, but we're not doing. So, we're on the same camp here. But there, the type of reforms are a bit different. One reform that I think is quite urgent in the case of China is fiscal reform. Basically making sure that local governments have their own taxes that they can raise so that they don't depend on the central government with big transfers every time. And they need to basically chase land sales, which they can no longer chase. So this is an urgent reform. pension reform is very urgent too, because a big chunk of the population is not covered, and there is very little portability of pensions across provinces. So this, in my view, will create additional income disparities. This is actually the best example is South Korea, where we have a big problem with poor elderly because of very limited access to pensions. So, we can learn lessons. Japan is very different from South Korea in that regard. So income distribution is better. I mean, I just think that it would be important to look at what happens when you age, which reforms you need to do before you actually are there full win as Japan is today, or South Korea for that matter. So yes, I do think there is painful reforms that need to be done. The other one that, I know it's a little bit tricky, but I'll finish here, is the reform of the state, meaning the very, very large size of the state in the economy. Any measure of return on assets of state-owned companies clearly shows that it is lower than for private companies. So I know there's a new legislation. Chujong could actually tell us about the new legislation to support the private sector in China, which has been kind of pushed forward at the NPC. So that might bring some hope for some reform that would bring up China's potential growth in the future.
Yeah, there is a law in the making, in the process for specifically protecting the private sector. And because, obviously in the past several years, there were some policy changes basically killed an industry like almost instantly, and so the confidence has been hit, and also from the COVID as well. And the online atmosphere, the public discourse is not exactly very friendly towards private enterprises as well. So yes, a law is in the process of being made. And the authorities believe that, it could be very helpful in future, basically guaranteeing the property rights of private entrepreneurs and help them to put them on an equal footing with their state-owned enterprises and all. Alicia mentioned a lot of very important policy reforms that could be contemplated. And there is also like the medical insurance and, for example, also, China's retirement age for its working force is, I think, for example, the women is even lower than European countries. So there is a lot of things to be done. And most of the low-hanging fruits have been harvested. And a lot of the reforms that need to be undertaken, they would, in one way or another, involve basically a transfer of the fruits of economic development or even power from, one part of the society to another. So yes, that is still very challenging.
Yes, indeed. There's a huge income difference in the Chinese demographics. So we would like to see that in the future there will be some redistribution and then to achieve equality in the society. And also, Lisa, when you mentioned the local government debt, I just want to point out that last year we did a podcast episode with Michael Petit that we talked about this issue specifically. So listeners, if you're interested, you can find the episode. I will also link it in the show notes. We're close to the ending of this podcast. Zichen, do you have any closing thought for us?
Well, you mentioned Michael Pettis. He is an authoritative figure on China's government debt. And one thing I think probably needs to be highlighted from this year's government work report is that the central government has been, increasing leverage, and the fiscal policy is becoming more stronger. The official language, I think, is to appropriately enhance the intensity of China's proactive fiscal policy and improve its quality and effectiveness. Yeah, and the central bank has created multiple tools, to guide lending more accurately to its desired industries, which China believes is of more strategic importance in the future and in the competition with the United States globally. But I just want to come back to the point I've been trying to make. I think, macroeconomic policies like fiscal policies, like interest rates, they are very important. But since she has personally talked about another reform and 2024 being a very important year for reforms, so I think that is what people should really put their hopes on, and the structural reforms, because there is just so many fronts on deregulation, overhauling the very inefficient sectors and the economic activities, freeing up rural land for more productive use. That should be the way to go in the future.
Alicia, the floor is yours.
I would end by saying that, as everything, the work report is words, and we now need to see the deeds. And I think Chichen brings us some hope that the deeds might be stronger than the words, and that maybe we do see some more consumer-related measures which will free the world from the massive risk of overcapacity coming from China and deflationary pressure. So I'm just very happy that we had this conversation so that we could hear more potential, basically positive factors behind this MPC meeting and what it means to the world.
Thank you very much both for this interesting conversation. I am Yuyun Zhan, and I am with Alicia Garcia Herrero, Senior Fellow here at Bruegel, and Zicheng Wang, Research Fellow and Director for International Communications at the Center for China and Globalization. For listeners, you can find our research at bruegel.org. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.